Good morning, everyone. It's good to see each one of you here today. If you're joining us on live stream this morning as well, hello. We're glad that you're with us as well. And if you're a guest today, my name is Ryan Russell. I'm the teaching and young adult pastor here, and we're so glad that you're with us. I'd love to meet you after the service. I'll be right outside these doors if you want to come by and say hello. We are in the middle of a series that we've been going through called Fragile and Frail, and this series is carrying us through the season of Lent. And Lent, I don't know if this is a familiar practice for you in the church or if it's brand new, but it's really a season in the church calendar that is all about this idea of teaching us that as humans, we are fragile and frail. It teaches us to remember or to realize that we are fully dependent upon God each and every day. The traditional practice in Lent is to give something up for this 40-day period of time. And really the idea is to give up something, whether it's food or social media or a habit that we usually engage in, something that would make us feel a little fragile and frail without that thing. That we might feel even just the slightest bit unsteady on our feet without it because we're used to relying on this thing. And that as a result, we do this strategically to train ourselves to reach for God for balance instead, so that He may be what we rely on to get through life. Throughout this series, we're going through the same passage, 2 Corinthians 4, verse by verse, and just sort of adding on a little bit more each and every week. And last week, we read 2 Corinthians 4, verse 7, which is sort of the cornerstone verse with the cornerstone image of this text. So I'll read it for us. It says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us." And so this text relies on a contrast, the idea that there's a treasure, but it's kept in a jar of clay. And that's a bit odd, because if you had a treasure, something that was really important to you, you would want to take good care of it, right? You might want to hold it tightly to protect it from anything that could do it harm. If you needed to store it somewhere, you would probably choose a container that would make it as safe and secure as possible. And yet, we're told in this verse that God has chosen to store His treasure inside of us, even though we are fragile and frail. These jars of clay that this text references, Joe told us last week that they were these expendable, highly breakable vessels that you could find anywhere at any market. They were not just a dime a dozen, they were a dozen for a dime. And yet the idea that God actually chose us, who are like those breakable, expendable containers, that why would He choose us to contain His treasure? It's really a profound mystery, a bit of a paradox. We're going to explore that a little bit more today. Back in September, we had our inaugural young adult event for our young adult ministry here at First Temple, and we took a group to Spare Time down the road and did some bowling together. We had a great turnout and a really fun evening. And I don't know if you're someone who does bowling often in your life, but I am not. I feel like I make it out to the lanes about every year or two, so I don't know all the fancy spins that you can use to knock down pins. I don't know how to do the split, if there even is a way. I just roll it down the middle and hope for good things, all right? That's my sort of bowling. But regardless of your bowling experience, if you've even been once, we all know this very frustrating experience that always seems to happen. If you roll the ball down the lane, and your ball will graze one of the pins, and it starts to wobble back and forth, sort of like this, right? And you're like holding your breath, sort of screaming on the inside, or maybe even on the outside, fall over. It just keeps wobbling back and forth, and much to your frustration, that pin somehow manages to stay on its feet. Well, this morning, we're going to continue Paul's story about being a jar of clay. He's going to tell us about his experience as a disciple of Jesus. And it's as if Paul himself is that bowling pin that has been knocked around but never quite knocked down. Just keeps wobbling back and forth. And he even wrestles with that question, how am I still standing on my feet? And it's almost as if someone is holding his feet on the ground. Our text is 2 Corinthians 4, verses 8 and 9. Paul writes this: "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. In these two verses, Paul uses 4 couplets to describe his experience. We are X, but not Y, right? Look at those 4 couplets all in one place. Hard pressed, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. Do you hear that wobbling that's happening? Struck down, but not destroyed. And Paul wonders, how am I still standing? You ever been in a season of life like that? Maybe that's every season of life, right? Paul goes on to tell us a little bit about his experiences and why he feels that way. He does this in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, where he goes through explaining his experiences. And you know, if Paul was a cat, he would not just have 9 lives, he would have 9 sets of 9 lives, all right? It is truly incredible all that he has been through. So I'll read here 2 Corinthians 11, verses 24 through 28. Paul says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 5 times he received beatings. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea. Are you seeing a trend here? In danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked, and besides everything else, as if that wasn't enough, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all of the churches. Can you start to see why Paul would say that he's wobbling back and forth like that bowling pin, hard pressed but not crushed, struck down but not destroyed? Hopefully, life has not been quite that hard for you. If it has, if you've also been shipwrecked 3 times, I have some unsolicited advice. You might want to stay off the boat for a while, okay? But even if your list isn't quite the same, you've been through a lot too. And if you started to compile a list of all of the hard and difficult things that you've been through in your life, I bet it would sort of amaze you that you're standing up on your feet as well. Our story, no matter what our story is a lot. And life is hard, and yet following Jesus makes life even harder, because following Jesus commits us to a way of life that is upstream, and it's countercultural. It's a way of life that puts us at odds with the dominant ways of the world. And so what Paul is experiencing here that he's described to us, and what we have experienced too, no matter what our story, is that life is several things. First of all, life is confusing. We work hard. We do all that we can do to do what God asks us to do, and yet things still happen that we feel we did not deserve. Life is confusing. Life is also disorienting. We start to realize when things aren't going our way that we really do not have control of life. We realize we cannot guarantee that things will turn out any particular way, no matter how hard we try. But life is confusing, it's disorienting, and it's draining. After some period of time of being unable to stay ahead or unable to keep our head above water, this wears us out bit by bit. Life is draining. Have you been there? Hard pressed, but not crushed. Persecuted, not abandoned. Perplexed, but not in despair. Struck down, but not destroyed. Somehow, still standing. And Paul wants to assure us that this phenomenon of life being confusing and disorienting and draining is first of all, this is normal. Okay? That we all go through hardship as followers of Jesus, and it doesn't mean that we're doing anything wrong. Even the most faithful people among us will experience life being difficult. And even those who appear to have their life all together, behind the scenes, there is a mess to see. Some of us are better at hiding it than others, but all of us go through the thick of life. And so if your life is characterized by internal angst and confusion and restlessness, pressure to measure up, you're not alone. In fact, this is actually something that you are in good company with. The Apostle Paul himself, one of the most faithful followers of Christ to ever walk the face of this earth, went through it as well. Hardship is common to every believer, and so rather than trying to escape the hard things of life, today we're going to talk about what it means to embrace it, and to embrace it as a reminder that we are fragile and frail, and yet God is always with us every step of the way. And so this is normal, and then second, this is also unsurprising. After all, we so easily forget that we follow a crucified Messiah who was beaten and suffered and died, and who told us that we should expect that the world will not welcome us either. And so if we struggle as Jesus did, more on this next week, then perhaps it's fitting, and perhaps we're actually sticking to the plot of the story. This is normal, this is unsurprising, and finally, this hardship is even intended. See, God has designed things. It was his plan for humans to be fragile containers, for us to be jars of clay that magnify not the greatness of our own selves, but the greatness of the treasure that we contain on the inside. Last week in the Modern Venue, Adam Dubberly, our modern music minister, preached and said this. He says, "It is through the cracks, breaks, and missing pieces that the light of Christ can be seen." And if it's really true, those cracks and missing pieces, that God's light breaks forth, and my goodness, praise God for the cracks in our life. We are fragile and frail, wobbling around like a bowling pin, wondering how we're even possibly still standing. And yet this reminds us that it is not in our own power, that it is the power of God. And this compels us to keep relying on him. We are but jars of clay. Recently, I learned about a Japanese artistic practice of pottery called kintsugi. And I created a collage of a few pictures for you of bowls and containers and vessels that represent this artistic style of kintsugi. Now, when you're washing the dishes at your home and you accidentally let one slip on the way to the dishwasher and it ends up in about 4 or 5 pieces, what do? You probably just throw it away, right? There's no hope of repairing this, right? If somehow you manage to fix it together and you're, got some material that helps you to do that, you might manage to somehow keep it together, but you're probably not going to serve it to your guests who come over for dinner, right? You don't want to hide those cracks and keep them up as sort of a last resort dish. That now it's become that in the pecking order, right? Well, kintsugi works very much to the opposite. See, each one of these vessels that you can see on the screen has been broken in some capacity. And so in kintsugi, when a container breaks, this gold material is used in order to restore it and to heal it. And so each of the gold cracks that you can see there is actually a place where that container has been broken. And that's interesting because kintsugi, what this means is kintsugi does not try to hide the container's brokenness. The brokenness is actually put on display. Kintsugi is all about highlighting the brokenness of the vessel. It's about featuring its brokenness, drawing our attention even to the spots that were broken but have now been healed. And as a result, the container is even more beautiful than it was in the very beginning. No other bowl has been cracked in the exact same way. And so this gives each container a personality, maybe even a personality that it lacked to begin with, even more beautiful now from being broken. The body of Jesus in the Gospels, in their Gospel stories, gives us a idea of what this is like. You know, sometimes when we imagine God coming and healing us in our brokenness, we imagine he waves like a magic wand over us. He goes sort of poof, and all of our cracks just go away, and we're restored back to factory settings as if nothing ever happened. And yet the body of Jesus instructs us otherwise. Because you see, when Jesus was on the cross, they put a nail through each one of his hands, and they put a nail through his feet, and he died and was laid in the ground, and then on the third day he was raised to life. And for the next 40 days, Jesus appeared time and time again to disciples and more people. And when they saw Jesus and they looked at his hands and his feet, they did not see factory setting hands, but they saw scars. They saw marks of the brokenness of his death on the cross. You see, God did not just wave a magic wand over Jesus and restore him as if nothing ever happened. He bore the wounds of his brokenness, even in his resurrected body. And what this tells us is that God's goal is not to erase our story, but it's to redeem our story. And the body of Jesus becomes the template for you and I, and also our bodies in the new life, by the way, for how our brokenness can be restored. Amy Julia Becker says it like this: the beauty comes not by trying to cover over or ignore the brokenness, but by transforming the brokenness. So I wonder, what if we viewed our own brokenness in that same way, as a thing of beauty, not something to be hidden, not something to escape from, but something to be embraced, or perhaps even to be featured. Paul gets more at this idea later in his letter in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, in verse 7. He tells us a little bit of a story about his own life and something that he's been through. And he writes this. He says in verse 7 of chapter 12, "In order to keep me from being conceited," Paul writes, "I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me." Now, scholars have debated over the years about what this thorn in the flesh was, and no one really knows for sure. Some people think it was some kind of physical ailment that Paul had, that perhaps, he had migraines, perhaps he had epilepsy, perhaps he had some sort of chronic health condition that was difficult for him to manage. Other people think it was some sort of psychological, issue he was going through, whether anxiety or depression. Others think that it was, some sort of temptation that persisted throughout his entire lifetime. I'm convinced that it's actually something a little more simple than that. I think our friend Paul was a Dallas Cowboys fan, because they've been a thorn in my flesh for about 30 years. So there you go. So no proof of that. Maybe I'm just projecting, but I really don't think so. Whatever the thorn in the flesh was, though, the point is that it was something that was uncomfortable for Paul, and that he really was pleading with God that God would take this thing away from him and make his life more easy. And yet, we pick up in verse 8 and we learn how the story went for him. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away, to take this thorn in the flesh away from me. But the Lord said back to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And Paul goes, whoa. And so he says, "Well, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." He says, "That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions." Think of that long list of things we read earlier that he's been through, in difficulties. I delight in them. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So Paul pleads with God to take this thorn in the flesh away, and yet God is unwilling. It's as if he says back to him, "No, Paul, I know you don't understand this, but it's actually better this way." He says to him, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." And that really spins Paul's world around. I mean, can you believe that language of delighting in weakness? So counterintuitive. Why would we delight in the things that we would rather hide, or the things that we would rather escape from, the things that we have pleaded with God to take away? Why and how could we possibly delight in those things? Incredible. And what Paul understands and wants to help us get as well is this idea that weakness is the path to strength. You want to be strong? You want to be secure? You want to be unmovable? The path to getting to that destination is actually to be weak. Because only then can we realize the power of God that shows up in our life. And so rather than hiding his weaknesses, Paul chooses to embrace them. No longer will he plead with God to take them away. He's come to accept them, and he sees now that it is only when and because he is weak that he can be made strong. The cracks in his life are becoming gold strands. So he says, why would I want to eliminate my weaknesses? I used to, but now I see that would actually be to my hindrance. It's better that I acknowledge them. It's better that I keep them. It's better that I lean into them. That is to my gain. Why? Because when I am weak, then I am strong. I wonder how that sits with you this morning. This idea of delighting in our weaknesses. Pretty counterintuitive, huh? And the idea, if we could just get our minds around it, is that even though our instinct is to hide our cracks or to plead with God to take them away, the cracks are what makes us beautiful. The cracks are what makes us beautiful. So I wonder, what are those cracks in your life? What are those weaknesses? What are those imperfections? What are those less than polished parts of your story? This morning, I want to give you about 3 things to consider. First is this. I want to invite you to reflect on what has made you you. Reflect on what has made you you. Do you think about your life? What are some of the key experiences? What are some of the key moments or memories that have made you who you are today? I want to invite you to even consider, especially consider those that may be the negative moments that have made you who you are today, that have left you with cracks. Maybe over time, those things have turned out for the best and God has redeemed them. Maybe that hasn't happened yet. Maybe you wonder if that even ever will happen. What are those moments in your life that have made you you? What are the top 3 to 5 biggest impactful moments in your life that have shaped you into the person that you are today? Here's the second thing I would invite you to do is to realize that this has not disqualified you, but has actually equipped you to bear the light of Christ. So those missing pieces, those broken places in you, this jar of clay, are the very places where the light of Christ can actually shine through. For that reason, we can actually celebrate them. We can be thankful for them, even though they've caused pain in our life. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how far you've run. It doesn't matter what you've lost. It doesn't matter what was done to you. The cracks in your life can be redeemed, and they can be turned into gold strands. And that is the gospel of Jesus. That Jesus was broken for you so that you could be healed. So if you're in a place today and you don't know that healing touch of Jesus, I would invite you to turn to him, to cry out to him, to say yes to him. We'd love to talk with you about what it means to have that relationship with Jesus. He can take the most wounded and most broken parts of our life, and he can turn them into gold strands. He can restore us into something beautiful. The third thing I would invite you to do today is to strategize how to tell your story in a way that features your cracks. Now, at times in our life, there are moments where we're not quite healed yet and we're not ready to talk about those things, and that's okay. But the reality is that very often, even after we've experienced some healing, that when we talk with other people, we want to present the best version of ourselves. Whether this is people we know well or people we just met, we want to make ourselves look impressive. We want to make it look as if we have our life together, whether we do or not. We love to pretend that we are a strong container that God has put his treasure in, where there is no need for any light to break through because we have got this. Yet I wonder if we can learn to be honest with others about those things that we've been through, those things that have made us us, knowing that when we do, it allows the light of Christ to shine brighter through our missing pieces. Now, our stories don't have to be victories in order to be told. They don't have to be finished to be told. They can still be in progress. You see, we don't have to be the heroes of our stories in order to tell them either. In fact, the best stories that we can share are not the stories where we are the heroes. The best stories that we can share are the stories about us being fragile and frail. The story about how we were weak and yet God showed up and he was strong. So I wonder what it would look like for you to even strategize about how in your life, through your relationships, you could go about talking about the things that have made you you in a way that doesn't try to hide, but actually features the cracks instead. What would that look like in your life? Not to do it in a way that's, looking for attention or that needs, sympathy or that involves shame, but just to say, this is what I've been through and look at what God has restored and redeemed me from. Look at how he showed up when I was weak. Of course, the implication is he can do the same for you as well. What we learn when we go through this pathway of being first weak and then strong is that being fragile and frail is actually counterintuitively to our great advantage. It's in our weakness that Christ's strength shows up. And so today as we close, I want to invite you to consider your own life and what this may look like for you. There's a question that I want to ask you to ponder, and it's this. It's what has made you you? What has made you you? What are those moments in your life that have led to cracks that could actually be the gold strands that God is redeeming? So as we close, would you bow your head and close your eyes with me? And rather than end in a prayer, I just want to give you a moment of silence to reflect on that question. What has made you you? And as some things come to mind, you just offer them to God. Be restored.